Hello and welcome back to the Technology Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. It's been many weeks since we've been on the air and seen each of you virtually, but we're very glad to be back. I think for this run, we're not going to do the 17 weeks straight that we did last time, but we'll shoot for maybe something around 9 weeks or so. But you can check out right now the first 4 weeks that we've already had scheduled. We have lots of interesting talks, which is scheduled, which is basically like everything that everybody's been asking me about for the past few months related to technology and gambling policy. We seem to be covering in the first 4 weeks. So I'm really excited that we have a lot of speakers that are bringing very contemporary issues to the forefront. I'm Khalil Philander, and I'm a professor at Washington State University. My co-host is Sally Gainsbury, who will be moderating this session. And so I guess there's not much more to get into besides just the content. We have some great speakers today. So I'm going to pass the conversation over to Sally.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and it's great to be back and tuning in with so many of you today and catching up after the session. So I'm really pleased today to be taking up where we left off and progressing our conversation. And part of the aim of the Technology Risk and Gambling Seminar Series is to feature not only experts in the field who have a wealth of knowledge to contribute, but also early career researchers. It's so important when the lack of face-to-face conferences and opportunities for rising stars to get the recognition they so richly deserve at these conferences, that we're able to provide a bit of a platform for people to see who's really doing the grunt work and making a good contribution and faces to watch. So today I'm really happy to have two fantastic people on the panel with me. I'll also be participating. So firstly, I'm sure most of you won't need an introduction for Dr. Mark Potenza, who is a professor of psychiatry, child study and neuroscience at the Yale University School of Medicine, where he is also director of the divisions on addiction research, the Problem Gambling Clinic, and a whole host of other roles. Professor Potenza is on the editorial board of 15 journals. He's received many international and national awards for research excellence, including the Lifetime Research Achievement Award from Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, the National Council on Problem Gambling. He's been broadly involved in so many advances in the field, particularly in the areas of neurobiology, treatment, substance and non-substance addictions, including participation in DSM-5 work groups, WHO meetings. So just such a fascinating wealth of experience. I will stop there because I could surely go on for the whole hour on his accolades, because I'm also really pleased to introduce Jing Shi, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Institute of Mental Health Policy Research at CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, which is Canada's largest mental health teaching hospital. She also holds an assistant clinical professor adjunct position at the School of Rehabilitation Science at McMaster's University and is a registered occupational therapist in Ontario. So her research interests focus on internet gaming disorder, gambling disorder, and tech-related addictions. Now, this particular topic, we'll take the liberty of just giving you a bit more of a background, came about from a commentary piece that was published with myself and my colleagues, including the first author was Tom Swanton, and this was published in Journal of Behavioral Addictions. There should be a link in the show notes and on the YouTube chat, but it's open access if you want to access it. It's a multidisciplinary framework of how different stakeholders can have responsibility for reducing harms related to problematic risk-taking behaviors involving emerging technology, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we couldn't really figure out a good way essentially to say new things that are coming up that we haven't thought of yet. So we're looking at this idea of, as technology is emerging, how that's influencing problematic behavior as well as obviously addictive behavior, with online gambling, but online gaming being the key examples. So this framework mentioned roles for industry, for treatment providers, for researchers, for community, for governments. And we didn't really intend this, but it ended up being the subject of an editorial and commentary from 5 different commentaries from about 11 different authors internationally, including one from Jing and Mark, who wrote in their response and their thoughts, which was exactly the intention of the framework, to be a starting off point for the conversation. So what we're looking to do here is follow up and pick up this conversation about how stakeholders are responsible or should be responsible for reducing online gambling harms, and what different roles they should have. So we're going to talk about the different stakeholders, what they should do, what they should not do, whether they can work together. So that's enough for me. What I want to do is turn over, and I might start with you, Jing, about your initial thoughts on when you might have read that paper, or what prompted you to write the commentary, and your thoughts on this topic.
Hi, Sally. So yeah, when I first read your initial framework, I thought it was an excellent idea to just name all the stakeholders that you initially named. So you said that individuals experiencing the problems should be included, of course, their family, friends, community members, researchers, therapists, treatment providers, government and policymakers, and as well as industry. And I think you started a great framework, talked about encapsulated basically a lot of the stakeholders that should be involved. And one thing that I've really wanted to focus on, that I kind of responded to with my paper, was more about the individual and how the family and people experiencing these problem video gaming and problem gambling should be involved more, especially with research. So more of understanding their personal experiences and what they're going through, really get a sense of the essence of the problem through their lived experiences. So I think that just in general, from a research perspective, that more qualitative work is needed to really understand what they're going through first.
Yes, and I too would like to share my thoughts about reading the original Swanton et al. Paper from your group. That I agree with Jing that this provided an outstanding framework and a basis for considering a number of important questions. And I think in the commentaries, including the one in which we were involved, that we tried to highlight a few additional points and add additional details, because in any one article, it's challenging to put in all the ideas that one might have, and one usually needs to, in 4,000 words or less, communicate a lot of information. So sometimes when one does that, there are ideas that are there that could be expanded upon. And we hope to do that and continue the dialogue that you and your group started.
Thank you for that background. And of course, I'm pretty sure all the commentaries are open access, so anyone watching can go and read up on the background. But I think, the tricky part of writing that framework was identifying different stakeholders. But really, I think what it comes down to is that balance between what is an individual responsible for themselves? Where is the line between personal autonomy, and where is the different responsibility that other stakeholders might have? Obviously, if it's the regulator or some sort of policymaker versus the industry just not creating that product. When I think it's almost a bit of a no-win situation sometimes when you say, the individual needs to take responsibility for themselves. But then if you turn around and say, well, the policymakers should just not allow that product, or there should be strict limits. So I was wondering maybe if you guys have any comments on that tension between creating obviously a safe product that's not going to be deceptive or misleading, and the kind of the basic consumer protection tenements that would go into anything you create. But particularly in gambling, where there is that kind of riskiness and that the tension between autonomy and enjoyment recreationally, where some people do obviously engage in disordered behavior, where different stakeholders might have different views on that, or should have different views on it.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important question, and it's one for substances and behaviors that have addictive potential. And I think that if one looks historically at, well, this is a focus on gambling, so let's focus on gambling, that in the United States, there the country has gone through periods of prohibition, and during these periods of prohibition, there has been illegal or underground forms of gambling, and this has also been seen in a wide range of other behaviors, including, for example, alcohol drinking. And so, given that there seems to be, at least in some portion of the general public, this desire to engage in a range of behaviors, you can pick your specific behavior, but here gambling, it raises a question of how does one best promote public health, and what is the balance between regulation of legal activities versus making things illegal, and the balance, as you noted, about individual responsibility and perhaps corporate or governmental responsibility in terms of protecting, generating a safe product, as well as protecting the public health. And so these are challenging questions, and I think it's important to have frameworks like the one that you propose to be able to address these questions, and perhaps do so in an ongoing fashion, given changes that digital technologies have brought with respect to the ability to engage in a wide range of behaviors, including gambling.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, speaking of personal autonomy and as well as policy in trying to regulate the activity, whether it be gambling or gaming activities, a lot of what we think is personal autonomy may not be actually our choice. So I think like sometimes the environment that we're raised in, the family that we have, some things that aren't our choice that influence our decisions could have made us do certain thing or do something excessively. And a lot of times, I think what your framework also captures is looking at the community, looking at more social determinants of health, and not only policy regulating the behavior itself or the industry itself, but also different aspects of health, different things that contribute to health that could affect individual decisions.
I love that point that it might not be the individual's free choice. I keep thinking Facebook likes or Twitter likes or whatever, like that none of us did that 15 years ago, and all of a sudden now there's a generation that can't live without them. So I think that's such a good point, that we're so shaped in what we have to do or what we want to do. That was really very well made. I mean, I for myself, I give you the taxi cab or the random barbecue example where someone says, "What do you do?" And I say, "Oh, I work at a university and I'm in psychology." And I kind of give as many degrees of separation before I fess up that I'm in gambling research and policy, because everyone has a view on it and you don't always feel like getting into it in the back of a taxi cab. So I think there's that interesting point that we work in a field that essentially everyone I've ever met has an opinion on, that is informed or not, but it's still valid, obviously. And there's obviously this kind of tension between community sentiment and individuals, and those views, by the way, are always quite different. So, like, there's the evil industry, or I hate that the government's trying to stop us from doing things. But Jing, given that you're the most recent entry into the field, and given your experience obviously in clinical work as well, do you think that there's enough being done now, or maybe that's a bit of a loaded question, or if you could start impacting policy now, at a local or national level, or maybe policy isn't the right word, what do you think are the biggest changes needed?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen in my brief time in research with video gaming addiction particularly, is that people are starting to, first of all, understand that there's different types of games, like difference between RPG role-playing games versus FPS, the first-person shooters, and recognizing how different types of games could attract people with different motives to play and different demographics. And so I think in order to make impactful changes to reduce harms, we first, like therapists and researchers and everybody needs to understand what they're dealing with first. So it kind of goes back to what I first said about the stakeholder framework, how I really want to involve more people who play the games, who experience problems with gaming, and maybe even the professional gamers, and if they experience it differently and how they manage their playing time. So I think it's really important to change the field in a sense to gain more of an understanding of what each emerging technology is. So not necessarily reinventing the wheel every time, but kind of you can still borrow from different addictions, but see how this new thing is distinct from other ones. And if there's different ways that we can help deal with it because of these different characteristics.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. And I think those points can be taken to a wider range of internet use behaviors, going beyond gambling and gaming. Sally, you had mentioned social network use, another by the likes and such. So another domain that we should be thinking about if people are engaging excessively and problematically in this form of internet use. Pornography viewing is another. But there are a wide range of behaviors that I think we need to understand better. And as Jing said, involving different stakeholders, including the people who engage regularly or problematically in such behaviors, is important in terms of coming at the research questions and the clinical treatment approaches in ways that may be more targeted. While we can learn from other areas in the addiction field, these behaviors are, as Jing said, share both similarities and have differences. And we need to understand those better. And we do need to do more from a research perspective, using both qualitative as well as quantitative methodologies. And the qualitative approaches may be very helpful at this stage in order to gather information to bring us into the real life lived experiences of people who we can learn from, and then perhaps utilize that information to target future studies.
I really like that idea because it's something that every single stakeholder group can do, is speak to the people who are involved. There's no barriers there. That's not saying let's all do, fMRI trials or something, something that's a bit inaccessible to some of the groups. But I'm interested, Mark, given your extensive experience with, DSM-5 committees and WHO, and I think when I've certainly been entering the field and I've seen it change, which is fantastic, but this kind of old mentality, pardon me, of this has been the way we've been approaching it, the focus very much on mental illness, and we'll just focus on the really pointy, problematic edge and clinical population. And these kind of systemic barriers to change, whereas this has just been the way it's always done. So even though new things are creeping in and completely changing the landscape, that they're still being regulated kind of by old rules. So, where do you think that tension is between, and then the interesting part about COVID, which we got to get into a lot last year, is that everything went out the window and all these things that said, well, you could never do that. It's like, well, it turns out you absolutely can do that. And you don't have to be, this is just the way we've done it. You can actually do a lot. I never would have thought casinos would turn off every other machine in their venue, put plastic dividers up, these kind of things that happen. So do you think that COVID, or like just that there's been a shift in the focus within the gambling field, in-house stakeholders who have traditionally kind of been responsible for harm are thinking about things?
I think that's a great question, and it's hard to predict the future with precision. What I would say is that my experience, I think, is like yours in that one of the aspects of the pandemic is that it has served as an accelerant for societal changes in certain domains. And one really important domain is in how people use digital technologies, for better or for worse. But I think for a lot of good purposes, a lot of, for example, telehealth advances that we may not have anticipated 2 years ago. I think there is much more telehealth delivery happening presently. And there's been an acceptance of that, and given the circumstances. But I think now that people have grown accustomed and comfortable with these forms of interactions, that the new normal is going to be different from what it was prior to the pandemic. So I think that we do need to be mindful of both the good aspects and the potential bad aspects. And with increased digital technology use, people may be in the future or presently experiencing more concerns with respect to problematic usage of the internet. And we need to gather those data and to try to help people as best as possible through policy prevention and treatment. And I personally have received more inquiries now regarding problems with gaming and other forms of internet use than I had prior to the pandemic. But I'd be interested, Jing, in your experiences as a clinician, what you have been seeing and experiencing in this area.
Yeah, I think from just what I've seen with telehealth, you mentioned telehealth, that is really great now that in a way COVID quickly made people quickly adjust and open up their practice to telehealth, because I think a lot of times for gamers and gamblers, accessing treatment was a huge barrier. So traveling to treatment facilities, finding the right therapist, going to their office was a barrier for if they had children to take care of, if they didn't have a car. Just a lot of that was removed because more therapists and clinics started doing telehealth. And I think that it's a great thing that, well, in one way, one benefit of COVID is that these it kind of advanced or changed the way therapists practice. But also in the media before COVID, a lot of things about video gaming was negative. So video gaming addiction, internet gaming disorder, a lot of that was mentioned, where people saw video games only in a negative light. And then COVID happened and people were starting to connect together online. They would have parties on Animal Crossing together, or different ways of connecting with each other and finding meaningful ways to use video games. So I think in a way, the how people are seeing video games now are changing. And so I think the message now that we need to give to children or to people in schools is that it's not just video games that are bad. There's safe ways to use it, and how can kids go about using new technologies in a safe way. So social media will most likely stick around. Video games will most likely stick around. There will be new things that are happening, VR, which will be more immersive. But instead of saying these are bad, it could cause harm, it's more about these are benefits that could happen, but in some cases, harm can also happen. What does that look like? And how can you go about getting help if you feel like that's happening to you?
And I think those are really important points because Sally, you had mentioned work on, for example, with the World Health Organization, when gaming disorder was being considered for inclusion in the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. There was active discussion about some of the points that Jing had raised about being careful not to overly pathologize activities, that we do need to be mindful that many people engage in gaming, and we don't want to stigmatize people, but we do want to help people who develop problems that are interfering in major areas of life functioning. So being able to have a balanced view with respect to those aspects, we thought was very important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think obviously from a treatment provider point of view and from a mental health point of view, there's a clear focus on reducing harm. But I've definitely seen different responses internationally, and from like thinking of relatively few jurisdictions, even in Australia, where we had obviously a very harsh shutdown. So all gambling venues across the entire country were shut for around 10 weeks, in some states longer. But then a bounce back, we saw an increase in gambling revenues across each state after the reopenings. And what that means is slightly uncertain, if that was a pent-up demand, if that was a few people going back and spending heavily. There's recently been allegations maybe that was just money laundering, that was all the cash that didn't get money like laundered, that went through the poker machines. But there has been this focus on physical safety, which I think is quite new. I think one of the benefits of COVID is a lot of the gross things we've been doing are now recognized as that was always disgusting. We never should have been doing that. So we've got better hygiene practices. But I think it's really important to look at whether governments are actively saying, okay, this is a chance to re-envisage and redesign, and not just with the focus on physical safety, but also for reducing harm, against that very clear tension of huge drops in tax revenue and income for the industry and the government. So that kind of tension, we want to claw back some of that revenue against all of the expenses we've had. And then if you look somewhere like the UK, where there's obviously quite a lot of disruption going on at the moment in terms of government inquiries and potential policy changes, both online and offline, compared to, and this is where I have less knowledge, and you obviously do, in the US, where it seems like states are rapidly opening online gambling for a variety of reasons, not all economic, but there seems to be less focus on reducing harm and more on kind of a race to open up. And so I guess maybe I'm keen to get your perspectives on this conflict of interest between reducing harm, profits, and even competition, because one of the motives is certainly to stop someone from gambling somewhere else. So, I mean, and I think that's a pretty valid excuse if people are going to gamble anyway. So where are your thoughts of, that how do the more conflicted stakeholders of industry and government, how have you seen any good approaches to that, or have you seen any bad examples of that? What do you think is needed?
Yeah, so I think that's I'll speak from the US perspective, that things have changed over time with respect to gambling. So if we go back, say, 70 years in the United States, there was only legal gambling allowed in Las Vegas. If we go back to the 1960s, is when the state lotteries were introduced, beginning in New Hampshire, and now the majority of states by the 1990s had legalized gambling, so 47 out of 50. There were changes in policy and regulation, some of which you mentioned about the individual states legalizing different forms of gambling, and then perhaps there being competition across state lines for different forms of gambling, or people going from one state to another to gamble, and then perhaps money going from one state to another. So, it is the United States where, each state has its own set of rules and regulations, and there are federal laws as well, but there's a states' rights that is part of the United States framework. So additional changes over time. More recently, the Supreme Court in the United States overturned the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. And this happened in 2018. And this opened the door for states to legalize sports gambling, which up until that time was much more restricted. So there is this change in addition to the digital technologies, but also with respect to state laws, as more states, as you mentioned, Sally, are making different forms of gambling legal. And how best to protect the public health in this setting is one where different stakeholders have become involved. So, for example, in 2019, I attended before COVID shut down, attending different meetings, a meeting that the NCAA, which is the Collegiate Sports Association in the United States, they had a conference given concerns about the changes in the gambling laws and in gaming behaviors among college students. They were concerned about the stakeholders within the college sports system. So different stakeholders are affected by these changes and are trying to work together to try to adapt and to protect the public health.
Yeah, I think in today's climate, it must be extra difficult for policymakers to kind of set regulations and policies, because if, for example, gambling, if your state has banned certain types of gambling or disabled certain types of features, people can easily go online and gamble and find what they want somewhere else. And I think that really, I don't know if this is possible, but find a way where globally policies can be set globally so that you get coverage, kind of the same protections globally, and you don't have people jumping around to different platforms or different venues. But I don't even know if that could be possible, because now with blockchain and the decentralized gambling venues, there's absolutely no regulations there. And even if somehow, governments all regulated gambling in every country, people could go to the decentralized casinos and go from there too. So I don't know what you think of this.
Yeah, it's a pretty good topic. We've actually got a whole session on blockchain and cryptocurrency, I think, next week. So certainly that's one of the aspects of, if you do over-regulate, is there unintended consequences? And I think that's actually an interesting question that's been asked more recently. It also is a bit of a red flag, though, because one key point that industry usually have up their sleeves are, well, we don't really know what's going to happen with that, so let's do some research and wait till we have all the answers before making any changes. So I think we have to be kind of careful about the precautionary principle of doing no harm versus waiting till we have a good understanding, a good evidence base, because we all know how long robust evidence takes to build. And that kind of tension between what different stakeholders are doing. And there are differences, and there's annoying things, I think, if a lot of jurisdictions within the same, so like states within the same country have slightly different rules, even within Australia, where there's, six states and a couple of territories, there's slight differences in things like responsible gambling messages. One might have the requirement you have to say, gamble responsibly, and the other state will have the requirement you have to say, set your limit. And they're kind of similar things, but each state has their own slight variation. It actually creates more red tape and administration, but to no particular effect. There's no real reason to have these differences. So I think there's this need for harmony where there is likely to be cross-jurisdictional use of internet gambling, particularly given the borderless nature of it. So I think that for me, I've always been an advocate of collaboration, of, as you both said at the initial point, involving end users in research, having clinicians and experts be put into policy. And I think that there's a role for that. And I know that's not there's some people that oppose that opinion of researchers working with industry and providing support or an even more contentious industry being involved in policy making. But I think there's at least, from my perspective, is there's at least important to hear the views and perspectives of all the different stakeholders, because even though I don't agree with everything that's been going on in industry, I certainly learn a lot from my conversations, because the industry have a unique perspective of their customers into, as researchers, we're trying to learn what's the motivation and why are people doing this. Well, often the industry know that, and they, build their marketing strategies around it. So I think it's useful for us to know that information as much as we can have collaboration. And maybe that's one of the kind of more contentious points of this framework, which is to what extent can and should stakeholders actually collaborate? And is that a way to reduce some of that conflict of interest if there's kind of joint efforts and collaboration and agreements to kind of set those aside to an extent and collaborate on the reduction of harms?
Well, going off of what you said about the industry getting insights from users, they're constantly doing that. They're constantly getting feedback from gamers. So I feel like that's why it's so important for research to do that as well. And some policies are put in, for example, the shutdown law in Korea, where they limit playing time for video games, hasn't been shown to be too effective, and in some cases causing more psychological distress for some of the gamers. So one thing again would be to go back and ask the gamers themselves, what are some things that you feel may be helpful? And from what I heard from some of the gamers that I've interviewed is that they don't want an imposed shutdown, but they would like some sort of control. So if they could control the time that their game stops working, so say at 8 p.m., I want my game to stop, rather than having an arbitrary number set by the government or policymakers, or if they can even set a time in the games where I play maximum 5 hours a day. And so some sort of more autonomy set control rather than a blanket overall control for everybody.
Yeah, and I think those are important points, because sometimes policies, even though they're well-intentioned, may not have the desired effect, and there may be unintended influences or outcomes. For example, if you take a time limit with respect to gambling, some people may increase the amount of their wagering nearing the end of the time. There are these individual differences that we need to take into account. I think Sally, Alex Blazinski did work, and maybe you were involved with this as well, with respect to slowing of the rotor speed on electronic gambling machines and not having the intended policy related effects in terms of trying to reduce the likelihood of experiencing gambling problems. People didn't enjoy the experience as much as I remember, but also people spent more time gambling given the slower slot machine speed. So we do need to investigate the impact of policy changes and different regulatory effects to make sure that they are having the intended effects and not having potential unanticipated effects. In this process, I think it would be great if multiple stakeholders could work together and could work together well. I think that there have been in the addiction field some examples in the past where sometimes that hasn't worked out as well as one would have hoped, where there have been restrictions on publishing of findings, given what the nature of the findings. That being said, if there are agreements in place that the communication of the results will happen regardless of the nature of the findings, I think that there is potential for significant advances to be made if groups can work together, including researchers with industry, because there's a lot of information, as was pointed out in our discussion, that has been collected by different groups in the industry, and being able to use data analytic approaches to this information could be very informative and helpful.
Yeah, they're really good points. And I like that you mentioned the fact that times have changed and evolved. We have had previous webinars discussing open science practices whereby there's pre-registration, there's transparency, all documentation is registered online with a stamped embargo that can't be changed before the research has even begun. All the data is shared, or as much as makes sense for privacy of participants. Ethics obviously needs to be approved. And there's a lot more transparency of everything, even the code used, so that someone else can go back and check. And I think that really addresses a lot of those concerns of any kind of bias to research, which is not only important for related to the source of funding, but obviously there's a pressure to kind of publish or to make significant results, because I think there's this concern that, well, in the past, industry funding has led to disreputable practices, which is correct, absolutely, but it's not restricted to industry funding. If we go back not very far, we see pretty dodgy research practices and what psychiatrists did, in the 30s and even in the 60s. So basically, society's ethical standards have changed, and industry is not by any means the only group who have done less things in the past that would not be viewed favorably as today. So I think we need to be really mindful of not forgetting any mistakes made of the past or practices, but not using that as the only reason to not evolve and try things again with better practices. But I want to pick up on one of the points you made, Jing, about limit setting. And what I've seen in the recent years is this emergence of third parties becoming involved as stakeholders. And that's everything from commercial or private or nonprofit online self-help apps to kind of aggregators of data to let you set limits, to banks and financial institutions being involved. So clearly for me, that shows that there is gaps in what services are provided and what's out there and what consumers want. If commercial parties can come and create a product that then it's obviously not been fulfilled by a government or a treatment agency or someone who potentially should have responsibility. And sometimes these end up being bought and offered by a community or an organization or something like that. But I was wondering what you thought about whether there should be, or the role of these kind of third parties or stakeholders who haven't traditionally been involved in reducing gambling harms.
That's really good. That's a really good question. I think that just points to how much we're lacking right now. And I think from all addiction research, we know that there's not a lot of people who experience addictions who actually seek treatment, and then even less who actually get treatment that they need. And so I think a lot of what ends up happening are self-management strategies that they use. And if self-management is enough, then they will go out and look for these different types of apps that will help, or bank strategies that will help. And so one of the ideas I had about reducing gambling harms was if there's some way of collating a database with different stakeholders involved, collating a database for self-management strategies for gamers or gamblers, where they can access links to different types of resources and different types of strategies, descriptions of different strategies that have worked for others in the past. Just some centralized website or system that they know they can go to for help. I don't know if that can be integrated somehow with everything else that's out there, or if there's other better ways of handling this. So I don't know from your experience if you've seen any good collaborations between industry, third-party stakeholders, people who experience problems, and researchers, if you've seen any ways in which this has worked well in the past.
Mark, do you have any comments on that?
Well, yes, I think that trying to bring multiple stakeholders together is an important way of moving forward. And I'm going to shift it a little bit to think about some of the experiences within the National Council on Problem Gambling within the United States over the past 25 years, where I've been attending the meetings, and I think I went to my first board meeting back around 25 years ago in the 1990s. And I'm, as a full disclosure, I'm on the board for the National Council on Problem Gambling presently. And back 25 years ago, the board was largely comprised of state council representatives, some of whom were in recovery from gambling problems, and there was more of an anti-gambling industry sentiment within the council. It was my opinion. But I think over time, the National Council has moved, I think, effectively to work together with multiple stakeholders, such that the board specifically has positions for industry representatives, because we believe it's important to get multiple stakeholders involved and to promote responsible gambling if people choose to gamble. And in order to do so, it's really important to have industry representation in that process. We also get a strong representation from people from the state councils, who often are working with people who are struggling with gambling problems. So they are very much vocal about trying to help people who have experienced gambling problems. So this group has worked to then try to inform and change policy. So the group also advocates at the Capitol in the United States, and we've been working to, for example, introduce problem gambling assessment questions in the military, particularly given the US military having electronic gambling machines on overseas sites. We think it's really important to be able to assess for gambling problems, and this is an area in which we can all work together to try to promote better health. So that's one example of multiple stakeholders coming together and trying to work in different areas, including with respect to prevention, treatment, and policy. And it's Problem Gambling Awareness Month this month, so I want to give a shout out to that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, how was that initially formed, and how is it funded? And has there been issues or power imbalances in forming it and funding for this?
Yeah, so I don't know the details of all the history, but there were some people who were pioneers from the gambling industry who were initially put into positions in companies where they were responsible gambling. They were in charge of overseeing responsible gambling for different gambling industries. So these individuals were in the gambling industry, they were attending the conference, and they wanted to work together. And so I think under the leadership of Keith White, he, over the past 20 plus years, has listened and tried to incorporate multiple stakeholders in the process, including people from the gambling industry.
I think that's a really good example. And I like the, mention of the military. It's a group that wasn't traditionally involved in gambling harms. As we're wrapping up, I'm going to kind of make a few comments and then throw it to you to either respond or go completely off onto a different tangent. I want to make sure you have your chances for final comments. But in my role, I've recently taken on as director of the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, which brings together the clinical and the research side of this. And we very much work to inform policy as well, and industry. We kind of, try and prevent harm as much as we can across the different areas. But something I've seen as a gap is the involvement of potential other social service or welfare or professional groups. Just kind of everyone really falls under that umbrella, that we know that people don't seek help for gambling at particularly high rates. Often problems develop for maybe 10 plus years until someone does seek help. And there's often people that don't need face-to-face treatment. So I think we need to, first of all, evolve what it is that we're trying to do in terms of prevention, reduction of harms. But I think we can really utilize a lot more resources that are currently available. So things like if we start to train, and there's an organization in Australia called Mental Health First Aid that provide what they're calling mental health first aid training for just the general community. And this might be someone in a workplace or just a community member that you can do a problem gambling specific course to learn how to recognize the signs and symptoms. But if we started developing training so that more professionals in obviously health, mental health, welfare, legal aid, I think financial counselors probably have some understanding of that. But if the more affiliated agencies and professionals who have gambling as one of their job descriptions, obviously recognizing, like a GP has a lot of things to go through on their checklist. So it's not just as simple as saying you should just start adding problem gambling screeners to all of your other, questionnaires. But if the more people who are aware of gambling, who talk about it, I think that's the other thing that we've learned from our experience, that professionals, they might be concerned about gambling, but don't feel they are equipped to have the conversation. Or if someone disclosed a problem, what would I even do with that? Who would I refer to? So the more we can train people, increase the education of professionals, youth professionals as well, we're creating essentially more roads into the appropriate treatment sources, which might be a self-help or an online. It doesn't have to be just face-to-face, but that's certainly a goal that I see as a systemic change we could achieve by increasing awareness amongst professionals and referrals to the appropriate treatment. And obviously that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I think that the more stakeholders involved, so if financial institutions or banks start to talk about gambling, it also has the other aim of reducing stigma. If people are asked about their gambling a lot, but if everyone is asked about it as well, it starts to reduce that stigma of, well, you only ask me about it if there's a problem. So I think the more conversations we can be having about gambling problems in society, the more stigma is reduced, and we'll start to identify those harms. So that's kind of on my wish list of systemic barriers to tackle. And I do think that really requires a combination of stakeholders. So it's a fairly ambitious one. I'll let you know, when I've achieved that. But, final comments from you both about, what do you think are the big wins, or what is your personal aim or goal, or something you think could be achieved?
I think going off of what you said about just letting all these different stakeholders know and talk to people and start asking people about not just gambling problems, but saying there's all these different behaviors in life. But if you're doing anything to excess to the point where you feel like you want to stop and you can't stop, or it's causing distress or harm in your life, then this is something that we can move forward to try to find either self-help or intervention or treatment for you. So not just saying gambling, gaming, social media addiction, but if there's anything in your life, any behavior that you feel like is causing you harm and that you want to stop, there's something that there's this particular treatment for you. And then also, as Sally, as you said, enabling and educating providers and giving them the resources necessary to be able to help them once these people reach out. And I think a way that we can start doing this is an idea from a gambling focus group, actually, where someone who was in treatment for problem gambling said that we need to start at a younger age, start at kindergarten level, where you're bringing awareness to kids about different things that could bring about harms. And once you start teaching teenagers, once you start talking to teenagers, it's not really prevention anymore if the teenagers have already experienced problems. So they're saying to just be awareness to safety, unsafe use, and safe behaviors, and how some behaviors become excessive or problematic. So
So
starting at a younger age.
Yeah, I very much agree. If we start the dialogue early, that's going to have a very significant impact. And to make people feel comfortable talking about their behaviors that, particularly behaviors that may have addictive potential. For me, I think trying to move the work forward in the different domains of policy, prevention, treatment, and involve stakeholders across the globe has been a particularly important focus of, I think, how we're going to make changes on a large scale level. And, towards that end, in different societies in which I'm involved, we've tried to focus on behavioral addictions. So, for example, the International Society of Addiction Medicine has a number of interest groups. One of them is a behavioral addictions interest group. And in our last conference, which was a virtual conference, the behavioral interest group had 3 symposia to try to bring together people from around the world and we were hopeful of bringing current findings with respect to behavioral addictions, including gaming and gambling, from both biological and treatment perspectives. 2 of the symposium focused on that. But some of the other larger scale efforts involving the DSM and the ICD-11, having gaming disorder be in the ICD-11 and having both gaming and gambling disorders be considered as disorders due to addictive behaviors, I think is a significant change and should help, I think, some of the important points that you both have raised about educating clinicians, because now if there are formal conditions that focus on these behaviors and these behaviors as addictions, that this should be a part of general clinical training as well as addiction training. So hopeful that with this foundation, there will be an increasing recognition of the importance of these conditions, particularly in the setting of the digital technology changes that we've been discussing, and perhaps the acceleration and changes in uses of digital technology during the pandemic and likely after the pandemic as well.
Well, I think, there's certainly a lot we could go into there, and I've been pretty proud of us. I think we covered a fair amount of ground there. So I want to thank you both, Jing and Mark, very much for being our inaugural guests for season 2 of the Technology Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm so glad I had a chance to chat with you about it. Again, the paper we're discussing is available in the Journal of Behavioral Addictions, first authored by Tom Swanton. It's a framework for problematic risk-taking involving emerging technology, and the commentaries are all available there as well, grouped together. But I want to really say thank you to everyone who tuned in. I'm sure you're in a different place, if not physically, at least in some aspects, than you were 12 months ago when we launched season 1. So hopefully onwards and upwards for us all, but hopefully we are bringing you some content that's interesting. And I do encourage everyone to share the links and to tune in to our coming episodes live or after the fact. I know the time zones don't work for everyone, so we're very grateful for the people who catch up online afterwards. But thank you again, Jing and Mark. Thank you to everyone who watched live online. It's fantastic to be able to share this content with you. And I'll throw back to Khalil to wrap up and tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear next week.
Thank you very much, Sally. And thank you, Mark and Jing. That was awesome. And it's just so good to be back here every week. And so next week, as we actually alluded to earlier in the session, we're doing a seminar on cryptocurrencies and blockchain-based gambling. And we have, obviously since the last time we we were running this seminar series, a lot has changed in that world. And so I think it's really timely to revisit it. One of our speakers from last season, Ollie Schulten, will be coming back. So Ollie recently published actually the first academic paper that I know of that actually used data from people gambling on the blockchain. And he analyzed that data as well as made it available for anybody else that wants to look at it. So he'll be joining us, and he's a PhD student in computer science, brings a very unique background to this seminar series. Also joining us next week will be Ingo Fiedler. So Ingo is an economist. He's a scholar at University of Hamburg and Concordia University, but he also is the founder of the Blockchain Research Lab. Ingo is actually, I think, the first person ever to really, in a substantial way, tell me about Bitcoin. And that was like so long ago. He might be Satoshi Nakamoto. He's been immersed in this subject for a long time. So we have a really exciting seminar next week. I hope you can all join us then. But for now, thanks for joining us this week. And if you ever want to get hold of any of us, all of our information is in the show notes, and we're all on Twitter and email too.